Okay, so this video is a follow-up to the previous video which introduced the idea of the ratio of marginal utility to price. Remember, in that previous video we were able to talk about how do you take this idea of quantity of goods consumed, generates a utility, and then turn it into what does a dollar buy you. Okay? So as you may remember from our previous video, we had our quantity of apples, the total utility generated by consuming that quantity of apples. We calculated that marginal utility, and we came up with the ratio of marginal utility to price. So just as a review, when we looked at if the ratio of marginal utility to price for this, going from consuming 0 to 0.5 bushels, generated a value of 40. The way we interpreted that was if we spend another dollar on apples, we're going to buy 40 additional units of utility. Okay, so that was what we did in the previous video. Now the trick is, how do you use this ratio of marginal utility to price to make a decision under constraints like only a fixed amount of income, or if you want to put it a different way, deciding how are we going to spend the next dollar? Do we choose to buy one thing or another? And so literally what we're going to talk about in this example is how do we actually compare apples and oranges? Okay? How are we going to make our decision of where to spend our money? So again, I already mentioned, just showed you the previous table for apples, and we have a similar table for oranges. So our price of oranges is $2.75 a bag. So first of all, we have a different price. We also have a different physical unit that's being looked at. Instead of bushels that we had for apples, we are now talking about bags for oranges. So we have our quantity of oranges, 0 bags, half a bag, 1 bag, etc. For each of those corresponding quantities of oranges, we have, if we consume no oranges, we get 0 utility. Half a bag of an orange, we get a total utility of 75, etc. Okay? So we could again go through the example of calculating that marginal utility. So if we were looking at the marginal utility of going from 0 to 0.5 bags of oranges, we'd say 75 minus 0, the change in the total utility, divided by 0.5 minus 0, the change in the quantity, and the number we would end up with is 150. You can check the work outside of the video. If we did it from 0.5 to 1, again, we do another calculation, and the value we would get is 84. So again, if we were to do the interpretation, if we consume 1 more bag of oranges, our utility would increase by 150 units. Likewise, with the ratio of marginal utility to price, we would take this total utility, or this marginal utility, divided by 2.75, the price of oranges, and we get a value of 54.54. And if we did it for going from 0.5 to 1, we take that 84, again, divided by the price, and we get a value of 30.55. So again, all we've done is just mimic the operations from the apple side. We've done it on the orange side. So now the next trick is to figure out how do we make a decision using this information. In particular, how do we use the ratio of marginal utility to price to figure out what we should do? So let's just start from an example of we're not consuming any apples or oranges. So we're at 0 and 0. And our question is, where should we spend our first dollar? Okay? So since we're starting at zeros, and we've calculated the marginal utility and used it to generate the marginal utility, ratio of marginal utility to price, we already have the measure that we need. So when we are consuming no apples and then consuming some more, then the ratio of marginal utility to price is telling us $1 will buy us 40 additional units of utility. So how does that compare with oranges? Well, again, we've already done all the calculations. So again, if we do the interpretation, this is telling us if we spend another dollar, an additional dollar on oranges, our utility should go up 54.54 units of utility. So the question is, which one do we choose? Well, a dollar spent on apples only buys us 40 units of utility, but a dollar spent on oranges buys us 54.54 units of utility. So obviously, we want to spend that first dollar on oranges. Okay? So it's a good practice. So let's see Well, and you're noticing that as we consume, at least with these two examples, as we consume more of the good, even though the total utility is going up, the marginal utility is going down. So what we're seeing is that as we consume more of a good, that marginal utility is coming down, which also means that what a dollar buys in terms of marginal utility will also go down. So we'll start now with this idea. We decided to buy oranges. So let's say we're at 0.5 bags of oranges, and we're still at 0 bushels of apples. So where should we spend that next dollar? Well, in going from 0.5 to 1, we get that ratio of marginal utility price of 30.55 over 1. So this is telling us another dollar spent on oranges will increase our total utility by 30.55 units. So it's not bad, not as much as it was before. But the real question is, how does that compare to apples? Well, since we were consuming 0 apples and we're still trying to decide if we should spend $1 on apples, we go back to this original measure, and we interpreted this measure as another dollar spent on apples will generate 40 additional units of utility. And so 40 is greater than 30.55. So in this case, we should be spending our money, our next dollar, on apples instead of oranges. So again, that's the idea of how we use this ratio of marginal utility to price. It literally lets us compare apples and oranges.